Hello, everybody.
Oh, hello.
Last week was a slow week. I did the meta-analysis for the POG championships, and then I kind of spent the rest of the week brainstorming and then filming the ads for the podcast that I run, Metapod. If you follow this channel and you are into podcasts and you haven't checked it out already, I'll put a link in the description. But so that's why it was a slow week. And this week might be similarly slow in some respects. I'm just waiting for the rotation to happen so that I can play stuff on ladder in a proper post-rotation format. But that is not going to stop me from digging into the winner of the POG championships yesterday. But before we jump into that, let me just give a shout out to the sponsor of the video, buyptcgeocodes.com. They are an awesome website where you can do, as the name implies, buy codes that you can redeem for packs in the game. They have a whole variety of codes, but the ones you probably are going to be looking for most is Darkness Ablaze. They have those. And if you use the code GyroSean, you can get 5% off of your order. So yeah, if you do that, it supports the channel. So thank you in advance if you need to get codes, if you use that. And thanks to Buy PTC Geocodes for sponsoring the channel. Let's talk about the winner. Isaiah Bradner has won the POG 2020 championships with, in my opinion, was honestly an unlikely winner going into the event. It's not that it's a bad deck or whatever. I just expected it to get power creeped out, and that is Pikarom. Pikarom somehow constantly manages to thrive in new formats, even though everybody writes it off, including me. I constantly do it. Knowing that my own POG run wasn't so hot, I wanted to take this opportunity to look at the deck and obviously like why it did well in the format, and see if there's things that I can take away that I can maybe, glean from that for myself and maybe for everybody else who's watching this as to what makes a deck a winning deck and maybe even what makes a player a winning player. So it's those two things combined. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the deck. What makes a winning deck a winning deck? Lots of decks can win a tournament, sure. But in a huge regional event like this, or semi-regional, whatever you want to call it, unofficial world championship, you got 1,000+ players. Odds are the best decks will bubble to the top. And with Pikarom, there was 8 Pikaroms in the top 32. 25% of the top 32 in day 2 were Pikarom. Why this deck? Well, first, let's just have a look at Isaiah's deck and see what maybe it had going for it. So if you look at the deck here, it has a variety of different things, but generally speaking, it feels like Pikarom. But Pikarom is known for one thing in particular, and that one thing is consistency. Prior to this event and any other event, for the last 6 months, 8 months, a year, it is just that consistency king, right? It has an uncanny ability to get off its full blitz attack going second, turn 1 so many times. Because you have so many tools at your disposal. You have things like Tapu Koko Prism. You have Thunder Mountain, still in format for the event. You have energy switches. And you even have great draw engines like Speed Lightning. This deck plays 4 Jirachis to help you find a lot of those things. You play Dedenes. You can basically churn through a decent percentage of your deck going second between your supporter, your Dedenne, your Jirachis, any of the cards that find you things like Tag Call and Quick Ball. Tons of options, even Guzma and Hala in here to find your Thunder Mountains directly. So tons of options to find what you're looking for to get started and get set up. And once you get set up with Pikarom, you accelerate more energy onto all of your other Pokemon. So consistency is this deck's strong suit. This is, in my opinion, the most consistent deck in the last 4 or 5 formats. Doesn't matter what the format was, this was the most consistent deck. Nobody could knock that about it. But people were constantly thinking, okay, it's consistent, but Pokemon are getting more and more powerful. So why has Pikarom all of a sudden been huge in winning tournaments? Not only the POG, but the last few weeks leading up to it. And I think that's because Pikarom, in the last format or two, has gained something that I think it didn't even have before, which actually made it better in the formats that it played in. And that is flexibility. This is the second thing, right? So a deck can be a lot of different things, right? But this deck in particular excels at consistency and flexibility. Flexibility, what I mean by that is that the game plan for the deck is not linear. People talk all the time about, certain decks being, easy to play, easy to pilot, because they're very linear, right? ADPZ is a good example of a very linear deck. You want to alter creation as fast as you can, and then you want to swing on them with ADP or Zacian using boss's orders to take, 3 prizes off of a Dedenne, basically. You do that twice after you GX, you win the game. Very, very simple. While that makes it certainly easy to learn, and while I'm not saying that skill doesn't play a part in any given matchup, the thing is the deck is linear. Your opponent knows exactly what you want to do basically every turn, and it's just how you get there that matters. Do you waste a bunch of resources getting there, or do you get there fairly easily and your opponent is like, they still got 4 metal saucers left in deck, and even if I knock this ADP out, they can probably power up a Zacian. So all of those things sort of combine to make ADP consistent but linear. Now, flexibility is stuff that other decks in the format do have. I think about decks like Mewtwo Welder, right? Or even Centiskorch. Those decks actually do have a decent amount of flexibility. Flexibility not just in the attackers, but like when you attack with something, you can offer your opponent different choices. Like, do I want to gust something up and maybe not knock it out, but set something up for a knockout later? Do I just take the knockout on this Volcanion in the active, even though it just knocked out a 2-prize Zacian, right? That's a flexibility that Centiskorch has. I would say that Mewtwo Welder, which did well in POG, has the most flexibility a deck could probably have, in that you have an attacker who can copy the attacks of any GX, basically. So that is inherent flexibility, and that's what made Mewtwo and Mew so powerful for so long, was the flexibility of using a variety of different attacks and attackers. But Mewtwo and Mew lacked consistency. Whether it was Jirachi Engine or lots of Dedennes with Welders, you might miss a Welder for a turn or two, and that might spell the end of it for your Mewtwo. So that was what Mewtwo did not have going for it. Pikarom, over the last few formats, has gained a number of things. Originally, it gained Tapu Koko V, a free retreater that does 200. It was fine. It wasn't a big deal. But the Rebel Clash format brought Bolton V to Pikarom, which was a good attacker because it is a 2-prize attacker instead of 3, which is very important for the deck. And it's a 2-prize attacker that can hit big numbers without having to use a GX attack. So that's part of the reason why in the Rebel Clash format, the deck did very well, is you had this new attacker that can maybe change up your game plan a little bit, and it kept your opponent off guard. That made it a little bit closer to Firebox than it did what it is now. The flexibility that this deck gained for the POG championships in particular was Vikavolt. That is what you saw Isaiah Bradner bring. He brought 2 Vikavolts in this deck, which I think I really like this call, because the flexibility it gives the player is not just another attacker. It gives you another attacker that has a dramatic impact on what your opponent can do. It's very disruptive. All of the other attackers that Pikarom previously had access to, other than Paralysis with Raichu, were not really that disruptive. And the Paralysis, let's be honest, your opponent might have a switch in hand and it doesn't really matter. There's 4 switches being run in basically every deck nowadays. Vikavolt, however, brings item lock into an incredibly consistent, hard-hitting deck. So you can power things up with Pikarom, and one of those things can be Vikavolt, which for only 2 energy, or 1 if you have Thunder Mountain down, can go in and just put somebody into a really awkward situation where they're item locked. And that can set up a variety of different situations. Maybe the Vikavolt hits into something, softens it up, you power up a Pikachu and Zekrom on the back, Tag Bolt GX for 4 or more prizes even. That is a massive, massive swing. And really, if you can get that pulled off and you knock something else out earlier for 2 prizes, that's the game right there. And your opponent may not have the resources it needs to quickly counteract that strategy. That is the second thing that this deck really offers, which is flexibility, not just in attackers, but attacking types, if you will, or gameplay flexibility, like game style. And that's the reason that Isaiah was able to win the championship, the finals. The finals event was against Sander, playing Control, which Sander is very much known for. And I would say Control is, not necessarily heavily favored, but it might be very tough for Pikarom to beat Control. And you saw that Isaiah was able to hold on in those games by focusing almost entirely on Vikavolt attacking. And what Vikavolt did is it slowed Sander down enough that Sander had to play Channeler very often and thus couldn't play Bolelba as a second supporter with Lieutenant Surge. Made a huge difference because that eventually timed Sander out. And so Isaiah was able to take home the victory by having won 1 game, lost 1 game, but taken more prizes in the end. I think the other 2 components to think about with Pikarom winning, or any deck winning in general, there's really 2 other components that don't have to do with the deck, but more have to do with the player and the situation the player is in. The first of those is going to be luck. I'm just going to throw it out there. I personally believe that this current metagame still has a lot of luck involved. Now, does that mean that a good player can't play around luck? No. But you sometimes just have games or entire matches out of 2 best 2 out of 3 where things just don't go your way and you lose and it's sad and there's nothing you could have done. And sometimes if that happens for a couple of games, that's all that's needed. A couple of unlucky games and a couple of games where your opponent just does really well, where your opponent gets lucky, even if you don't get unlucky, then you're out of a tournament, especially in best of 1. And I think this current format definitely favors people that draw well early and basically have more luck than you. There's nothing you can do to really counteract that beyond what we've already talked about, which is building to make your deck as luck-proof as possible. And I think the last thing that is important for any player going into a tournament is finally skill. There is still a skill component to this game, whether you're running Baby Blounds, ADPZ, Pikarom, or Control. Control, I think, especially highlights good skill. Sander is a master of that. So skill in terms of piloting the deck, knowing how to thin the deck, knowing how to look for certain resources at the right time, and knowing the matchup. And I think Pikarom, as an example again, why this one was able to win, is it was piloted by a player who not only built a deck that made sense for the tournament, but then was able to correctly identify the right way to pilot the deck in any given matchup. Pikarom versus a number of normal decks, straight up decks, you want to go in and attack with Pikachu and Zekrom. You want to build up some damage on the board, take big knockouts, get the Tag Bolt GX off potentially, and you got to go fast, right? Sonic the Hedgehog style. But when he played against the Control matchup, immediately being able to identify the only way I'm going to win this is with Vikavolt, and he wastes almost no resources beyond what's necessary to find and set up the item lock as best he can. That, I think, is a critical component, because if you aren't very well versed in the variety of matchups you might face with any given deck, you will be caught off guard and you will almost certainly misplay. So the thing that I can take away from all of this is when I'm building my decks, either being aware of what my deck's natural strengths are and weaknesses and just accepting that, or trying to find ways to make my deck as consistent as possible. That's something I need to keep reminding myself. I think my tournament run was that realization that, like, yes, I made a pretty consistent ADPZ in my opinion, but I'm sure there's more I could have done. So how do I focus on that? And then finally, how do I make things more flexible in a deck? When I'm building a deck, how do I make my strategy not so obvious to my opponent? Because that does put you into situations where your opponent can easily read what you have, what you don't have, and what options you have available to you. And if they can play around that option, that linearity of your deck, then you don't have any way to respond. So finding options for flexibility is important. And then finally, accepting luck and then just practice. Just gotta practice. So this was partly a retrospective for me, this video, but hopefully it was interesting for you to understand like my take on why Pikarom was able to win this tournament. Surprising me, maybe not surprising you. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Like, what other things did I miss about why Pikarom just continues to be so good? Do you think it'll still be good in the next format? And I'll catch y'all in a future video. Carpe awesome.